Let's go JavaScripting! Hi everyone and welcome to another exciting edition of Boring JavaScript. I'm your host, the Virtuoid, aka Mike Smith, and today we're going to be doing something really fun. I'm going to show you how to get one of these working with your browser games. Can't wait to see it? Let's get started. Interfacing your gamepad to your browser game is really simple. You just need to know three things: when the gamepad has been connected, when it's been disconnected, and when a button has been pressed, or an axis has been moved, or whatever of all those hundreds of controls that are on the gamepad. So, real simple to do. Let me show you the connection part. We'll show you the buttons a little bit later. First of all, I got an HTML file here that will give me all the different controllers that are connected to my system. There's a maximum of 4 controllers that can be connected to a system. And I'm going to have a little log file here to tell me when a controller has been connected and when a controller has been disconnected. Now, I only have one controller hooked up here. I can't show you 2 or anything like that. I would love to, but I only got 1. So there you go. So let's take a look at the JavaScript file and see what it does. All right, to be able to first figure out when a gamepad has been connected or disconnected, we just do simple event listeners. We do one event listener on the window object for gamepad connected event. And when the gamepad connected event fires off, that means a gamepad somewhere has now been officially connected to the Windows system. And if so, execute this routine. When the gamepad disconnected event occurs, that means that the controller has been removed from the Windows system, and so therefore execute the gamepad disconnected system. That's it. I mean, that's real simple stuff right there. So let's go to those 2 events. Both of them are going to work the exact same way: gamepad connected and gamepad disconnected. Each of them are going to pass an event object, and within the event object is a gamepad object. Now I'm using it here on line 2 to show you the example. The gamepad object is which gamepad has been, in this case, connected, or in the case of disconnected, has been disconnected. And it's important to be able to note that that gamepad object has all the information you need about the gamepad, which buttons are pressed, what the position of the sticks are, and so on and so forth. But the important thing here is an index property. Oh, there it is right there, the index property. And the index property of the gamepad tells you which index is being worked on, or has been connected, or has been disconnected. And that is because that when we get the data in from the system here, it's actually going to not give us data on a single gamepad. It's going to give us data on all the gamepads in an array type object. So we need to know which index within that object, within that array, excuse me, has actually had some sort of connection or disconnection occur. So that's what this log file is all about here. Now, all I'm doing here is just logging the information here. I am logging which index has been connected with a 0, 1, 2, or 3. And in my case, it's always going to be 0 because that's the connection that I've got here. And the same thing with the disconnect. And that's all there is. It's real simple there. Now, getting the data. Very simple. Let's go to line 11 here. This is how you get the data. Navigator.getGamepads. And when you do that, it returns an array-like object of all the gamepads that are connected to your system. And all you have to do is go through each one of those gamepads and say, okay, gamepad number A, it looks like that the axis has moved to the right a little bit. Gamepad number B, oh, it looks like they're pressing the A key. Gamepad number 1. Gamepad number 2 is null, which means there's been no gamepad 2 connected, and gamepad number 3 is also null, which means there's no gamepad connected there either. That means I only have 2 gamepads connected. So that's how you get the information. Now, here's the critical thing you need to worry about. How to get the gamepad information is not like you would normally get from, let's say, a mouse click or a keyboard. Those are events. You know, for instance, if you click on the left click a mouse, or you press a key on a keyboard, you have an event listener that listens for that, and when that happens, the system sends it over to JavaScript to processing. Well, you don't get that with gamepads. Whenever you click, let's say, the A button or a D-pad or move the axis sticks or something like that, no events are generated at all. So how do you know what the current values are? Well, that is what we call now, we'll get into a loop. Let me try that again. We'll get into a loop from JavaScript that we call animation frames. Now, what is that? What happens is that internally within JavaScript, about 60 times a second, it will go through and say, hey, do I need to make any updates to the graphics on the screen? You know, for instance, if you got a CSS animation going on or whatever, if that answer is yes, it goes through and does the adjustments, and then it goes to the next routine one after another. And it goes through this process about 60 times per second. That's a 60 FPS frames per second. So what the request animation frame does is say, hey, when you're going through this list here, I want you to now also execute this particular piece of code within that stack there that you're running to be able to figure out what to draw next. And JavaScript will say, okay, good, okay. Oh, I got to now run this particular piece of code, and then once I finish that, I'm going to go back to what I originally was doing. And to be able to do that, we run what's called a request animation frame. It's a special verb inside JavaScript that says, okay, insert this function within your normal painting update stack system, whatever the internals are with that. And we have the updated connected in this case here, which is our routine that we're going to use. So 60 frames per second, 60 times per second, JavaScript goes through and says, oh, okay, I got to run this updated connected command. Okay, updated connected. That's where we get the navigator.gamepads. So 60 times per second, we're going to strobe that gamepad to find out what has been pressed. Now, in my particular case here, all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to flip through all the different gamepads, and I'm going to create an LI element to append to that UL element to be able to say what's been connected and what's been disconnected. Now, the only thing to remember about request animation frames is it's a one-shot deal. Once you request the animation frame and it executes your code, it kicks it out of the system and it continues on its merry way. So within your loop, you're going to need to basically request again. And this will push your routine back onto the stack for it to be able to execute next time around. And again, this happens like 60 times a second, so speed really isn't much of a problem in that particular case. So that's how you get the data. The big thing here to remember, it is not event-driven like mouse and keyboards normally are. This is a system where you have to drive the events to be able to grab the data. In this case, we're using the animation routines within JavaScript to get that for us. And that's pretty much it. Real simple to be able to use. So let's go over to the browser. And inside the browser here, I'm going to do a Control F5 to clear it. Now, right now it's sitting here running because the first thing I did once I finished it was a request animation frame. And I'm doing a request animation frame now 60 times per second. So as soon as I press a button on this controller, Windows knows that controller is activated. It's going to send it over to the browser, and the browser is going to say, oh, I've been activated. So let me press the B key or the B button. Ta-da! There it is. Gamepad number 0 is connected. Let's play. So everything now that I do on the keypad is being controlled within that animation frame there, and I can get all the button information, which again, I'll show you with the next segment here. So what happens if it disconnects? Well, let's disconnect it by pulling it out of the USB port. So if you'll excuse me, I got to get to my USB port over here. Let's get over here and let's unplug it. Oh no! Look at that, it's been disconnected. So as you can see now, even disconnected works because we disconnected the keyboard. We got the log file there. So the next time that I did the navigator.getGamepads, it says, oh, whoops, gamepad number 0 is now dead. Now earlier, nothing activated until I pressed the button on the gamepad. But now that the browser is already running and already knows that my gamepad has already been activated, it now knows to activate it again once I plug it back in. So let's go plug it back in and see what happens. So let's get in here. There we go. I plug it back in. Xbox 360 controller, standard gamepad. I'll tell you about standard gamepad here in a second, and how it's been disconnected. So that's how you can get the gamepad into your game. Real simple. How to connect, how to disconnect, and how to grab the data. Now, what data are you grabbing? That's next. So now we know how to connect, how to disconnect, and how to grab the data. How about the actual data itself? There is a lot of data that is passed from the gamepad to your system that we can now manipulate and do whatever we want to with in our game. So let's first of all take a look at the kind of data I'm going to get here. I'm going to get some connected data, whether it's going to be connected or not. I'm going to get the ID, which you've seen the ID in the last one. That was the thing that I put in the very beginning in the unlisted, excuse me, the unordered list. I'm also going to show you the mapping, and that's going to be critically important, as I'll show you here in just a second. Here are all the different buttons that are available to us, all the way to an unknown button, because my particular controller didn't have that final button on there, but we have the A button, the B button, XY button, the left top, left trigger. If you can see on my system here, left trigger, right trigger, a whole bunch of fun stuff there. Home select, start, left stick, right stick, D-pads, all that kind of fun stuff. Plus the axes, and these are the two little sticks that are on the controllers that give you a number between -1 and 1, depending upon an X and a type of Y axis. No big deal there. So let me show you how that information is gotten into our system. So let me flip back over to our code. As you can tell here, I've got my connect and disconnect just like I always have. no big deal there. Inside my connection here, I'm going to do a couple of things, but notice the very last thing I do here is do a request animation frame. Because remember, there is no events that are generated by these gamepads. I've got to have my own little loop, and I'm using the animation loop to be able to insert a routine in there to be able to grab the data. And that's with the update table. So the first thing I do in the update table is I get the gamepads. Now, when the connected thing occurred, I saved the gamepad index because I know I have just one gamepad and I'm only going to use one gamepad. So I saved the gamepad index and I'm always going to get the first gamepad. So gamepad became the first gamepad index. And then I'm going to do a whole bunch of fun stuff to be able to, to display the data, and then we'll request the animation frame. This is the exact same thing we did last time. So how does all of this work? Well, there's three important pieces here. The first one is the buttons array. There is an array of buttons, for lack of a better term, on the gamepad. And this array of buttons gives you the status of all the different buttons on your system. The A button, the B button, the X button, the Y button, left trigger, right trigger, so on and so forth. But each one of those are not listed by name. There are no names. It's actually physically an array. B0 could be a certain, the A key, it could be the X key, it could be the B, whatever. All the way to B, I think 16 or 17, I can't remember off the top of my head what the number is, but the fact of the matter is, there's no identification marks within the buttons here to say which ones they are. I just happen to know whether they are the A button or the B button, the X button, or the Y button, and I'll show you that here in a second. Same thing with the axis. The axis itself are right down here, allows me to get the data value for the X and the Y axis, but all that axis information, is available to me as arrays, but there's no identification. Am I talking about the left stick or am I talking about the right stick? Well, I don't know. So we've got a bunch of a button array here, and we got an axis array here with no identifying remarks. How do we know that button 0 is the A button, or maybe is button 15 the A button? Well, we know that by what's called the mapping. And the mapping is located right here in line number 48. There is a special part of the gamepad called mapping. And mapping says what is the physical mapping of the gamepad to, or the gamepad to the buttons. And there are some standard gamepads. In fact, in a particular case, the Xbox that I'm using here is called a standard gamepad. There is another gamepad called the Xr Gamepad. And let me flip back over to my browser real quick. And let me show you what that looks like. This is basically an XR standard controller, and it has an XR standard gamepad. So in this particular case here, if we had this particular one here, button 0 is the trigger with the forefinger there. Button number 2 is the touchpad pass. Axis 1 and axis 0 and axis 1 is the roll button. And the platform button in this case happens to be not exposed. And there's a more complex one down here. But as you can see here, although we have an array of maybe 16 or 17 buttons, this one only uses maybe 6 buttons or just a couple of axes on there. So that happens to be a standard XR standard controller. In our particular case, let me flip back over to the code here. In our particular case, we're using what's called a standard. So what I did is I went online there and I figured out what the standard mapping is. And so I've set myself up on a map here within JavaScript to say, okay, button number 0 is the A, button number 1 is the B, button number 2 is the X, button number 3 is the Y, and so on and so forth. And I have one final unknown here because for some reason my particular controller didn't have that final button on there. Other ones might, I don't know. So you may have to take a look at that and figure out what's going on there. But doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter at all. We have this information available to us. So now we're able to associate different buttons from this particular section here. We're able to associate different buttons with the buttons that are physically on the controller. And so then it's just a real simple thing of just going through the whole list here and displaying it out on the screen. And that's it. You want to take a look, see how it works? Let's flip back over to our browser. I'm going to do a Control F5, just kind of clear everything out here. And I'm going to pick up the controller, and I am going to activate it by pressing a button. And there we go. So as you can see here, I am now connected. There's my ID. It says it's a standard gamepad, so that's how I know it's actually a standard. Well, that's one of the reasons I know. But the big thing here is the mapping standard. If that was one of the XR standards, I would have XR-standard there as the value there for mapping. But now that it's a standard mapping, I can map this controller. And so that's a way that if you have the different mappings within your system there, you can have a bunch of different types of controllers connected, and you already know which ones you're working with. You don't have to worry about it. So here's all my buttons. Most of them are off or on. They're either pressed or they're not pressed. The only two that are different are the triggers. The triggers basically will give you a number between 0 and 1 based upon how far in you have pressed it. And the triggers are located usually at the very, if you can see my pad here, the triggers are located at the very top, are located at the very bottom of the front here. And if by pressing those in, they'll give you a number between 1 and 0. So let me press the A. As you can see, it turns the on. Let me press the B. Yep, that's right. X. That's right. Y. That's right. Left top, which is up here in the front of the controller. Right top. Here's the left trigger and the right trigger, which I'm barely pressing to get it to go from 0 to 1. So 1 means basically it's all the way pressed in, and 0 means it's not pressed in at all. And the same thing with the right trigger. It's either barely pressed in or not pressed in at all. That's a good little accelerator button, I guess. So there's a home select button, which is this one right here. There's a start button, which is right here. There's a left stick. Now these two sticks, of course, are axes, which you'll see down at the very bottom there. But they're also push buttons. So I can push the left stick. And that will go on. The right stick will go on. The D-pad is located right here in this particular controller here. So I'm pressing that up. I'm pressing it down. I'm pressing it left and pressing it right. And mine doesn't have that last one there. And I don't know where that number's coming from, so I have no clue. And down at the bottom there are the two axes. These are the axes on the left and on the right here. So as I move them, they go from 0 to -1. And I'm kind of moving them both, just moving them every which way but loose. So by going between 0 and -1, this will allow me to be able to get, a much finer grain control. Very, very nice, for example, for moving people and things like that. I don't know, whatever your game happens to be. So this is how you capture the buttons. It's really simple and very easy to do. And that's all there is to using the gamepad on your browser. I hope you enjoyed our video. Hope I didn't bore you to death. Please view all of our videos at www.boringjavascript.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel or check out everything we have at www.thevirtuoid.com. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you later.